I was 16 when my stepfather threw me out of the house. He didn't lower his voice or try to hide it. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and said, "You're not my blood, you're not my problem." Those words cut deeper than anything I had ever heard. I can still feel the way the air went heavy in my chest when he said them, like he had ripped away every piece of security I had left. My name is Ethan Ward. At the time, I was just a skinny teenager with a backpack, a few clothes, and no real plan. I had spent years trying to win the approval of the man who had married my mother, a man named Colton Brigg. He was tough, sharp around the edges, and never once called me son. To him, I was the reminder of another man, a man he had chosen to erase from our family story. My mother, Mara, stood behind him that night. She clutched the hem of her sweater, tears in her eyes, but she didn't stop him. Her voice shook as she whispered, "I'm sorry, Ethan. Please, forgive me. I wanted her to fight for me, but I also saw the fear in her face. She had been living under Colton's shadow for years, and I knew she felt trapped. I remember stepping out into the dark, carrying nothing but my bag and the small silver locket she had given me when I was a child. It had been my comfort, the only piece of my father I thought I had left. The door slammed behind me, and I realized I no longer had a home. I was 16 years old, standing in the cold, knowing that I had just been abandoned by the only family I had ever known. From that night forward, I lived on the streets. I scavenged for food, slept under bridges, and begged strangers for change just to make it through the day. Each night I asked myself the same question: why did my real father leave me behind? The bitterness of that question became my companion. But life has a way of twisting itself into stories you never expect. 14 years later, when I was 30 years old and working as a dishwasher in a rundown diner, a man walked through the door who would change everything. His name was Silas Crane, and the first words out of his mouth were, "I've been searching for you for 14 years." He carried an envelope that contained the truth about my life. The truth that shattered every belief I had about who I was and why I had been left to suffer. Inside was a bank statement with $73 million attached to my name, and a letter from my biological father explaining why I had to be hidden. That night, when Colton Brigg threw me out, I thought my life had ended. What I did not know was that it was only the beginning. Before that night, when Colton threw me out, my life had already been built on shaky ground. I was born in a small town in Ohio, and for as long as I can remember it was just me and my mother, Mara. She was a quiet, gentle woman with a voice that always carried a note of sadness, even when she smiled. I grew up asking about my father, but she never gave me more than a vague answer. She would say, "Your father loved you, Ethan, but he couldn't be here." That was all. As a child, I accepted it. As a teenager, it started to feel like a wound that would never close. When I was 10, my mother remarried. That was the day Colton Brigg entered our lives. Colton ran an auto yard on the edge of town, fixing up old trucks and scrapping parts. He was the kind of man who wore oil-stained shirts even to church, the kind who spoke in a tone that made people either shrink back or stay silent. At first, I thought maybe he would be the father figure I had been missing. I was desperate for someone to teach me how to throw a baseball, or to sit me down and tell me how the world worked. But Colton never looked at me that way. The first week after they married, he called me boy. Not Ethan, not son, just boy. At the dinner table, he would ask, "Boy, did you finish your chores?" When I got a B on my math test, he sneered and said, "Boy, you'll never make it anywhere with grades like that." Each time, it stung. I remember one night I asked, "Can you just call me Ethan?" He set down his fork, stared at me with eyes that looked like steel, and said, "You earn a name in my house. Until then, you're just boy." My mother sat silently, eyes on her plate. That silence became normal. Life with Colton was like walking a tightrope. If I did well in school, he found something to criticize. If I tried to stay out of his way, he accused me of being lazy. The only moments of comfort came when my mother would sit on the edge of my bed after he had fallen asleep. She would tuck the blanket around me and whisper, "You're stronger than you think, Ethan. Just hold on." Her words carried me through many nights, but even then, I could see the exhaustion in her face. She worked long hours at the grocery store to keep food on the table, and her body carried the stress of trying to keep peace in a house where peace never lasted. By the time I was 15, I started dreaming of leaving. I thought maybe if I worked enough hours after school, I could save for a small apartment. I found odd jobs mowing lawns, carrying groceries for elderly neighbors, and helping stock shelves at the corner store. I gave half the money to my mother, but Colton always said it was never enough. He demanded I quit school to work full-time in his auto yard. "What good is algebra when there's real work to be done?" he barked one night. I told him I wanted to finish high school, maybe even go to college one day. His face twisted with anger, and he told me I was full of foolish dreams. That tension grew heavier every day. Colton's resentment toward me was like a storm cloud that never moved. He would slam the door when I came home, mutter insults under his breath, and tell anyone who would listen that I was nothing but a mouth to feed. Neighbors pitied me, but no one dared to confront him. I lived with the constant knowledge that my place in that house was temporary, dependent on his temper. There were moments when I tried to fight for a sense of belonging. Once, I brought home an essay I had written for English class. The teacher had written, "Excellent work," in red ink at the top, and I felt proud. I showed it to my mother at the kitchen counter, and for a moment her face lit up with joy. But before she could say anything, Colton snatched the paper from my hand. He read the first line, scoffed, and tossed it into the trash. "Words won't put food on the table," he said flatly. I wanted to shout, to demand that he see me for more than what he imagined, but the words froze in my throat. That was my life before the night he threw me out. I was a boy trying to carve an identity in a place that refused to let me exist. I carried quiet dreams in my chest and clung to my mother's whispers of encouragement, but I knew deep down that Colton was waiting for the moment to cast me aside. Looking back, I can see how those years hardened me. They taught me how to work, how to survive without affection, how to rely on myself. But at the time, it felt like a slow erosion of who I was meant to be. I was not treated like a son. I was treated like an intruder in my own home, tolerated only because of the woman who loved me. That introduction to manhood shaped everything that came after. By the time I reached 16, I was standing on the edge of a choice: stay and lose myself completely under Colton's control, or resist and face the consequences. I did not know it then, but the moment of resistance was coming fast. It would tear me from the little safety I had left, but it would also set the stage for everything that followed. The breaking point came in the summer after I turned 16. School had just let out, and while most kids were talking about part-time jobs and planning trips to the lake, my reality was different. Colton had made it clear he expected me to start working full-time at his auto yard. To him, summer wasn't a time for rest. It was the season when business picked up, when men sweated in the sun stripping parts and welding frames. He looked at me one evening across the dinner table and said, "Starting Monday, you're mine, from sunup to sundown." I pushed back in the only way I knew how. "I want to keep working at the corner store too," I told him. "I need to save for school supplies and maybe some college applications." He slammed his fist against the table so hard the dishes rattled. "College? Don't make me laugh. You're not cut out for that. You'll break your back for real work, or you'll end up a bum." My mother lowered her eyes, her fork frozen in midair. I wanted her to defend me, but I also knew her fear of him was stronger than her voice. The argument didn't end there. For days, Colton repeated his command every chance he got. "The yard opens at 6. You'll be there at 5:30. He left notes on the fridge reminding me of my duties. He even came to the corner store once and barked at my boss that I was wasting my time stacking shelves. I knew what it meant to defy him. Still, something inside me rebelled. I couldn't let him crush the small piece of hope I carried. I wanted more than grease-stained hands and angry shouts echoing in my ears. The final confrontation happened on a humid Thursday night. The cicadas buzzed outside, and the air smelled of gasoline from Colton's work clothes. I had just told him that I wasn't quitting school or my job at the store. His face turned red, and he pointed toward the door. "You think you get to choose?" "Not in my house. You either work for me, or you don't live here." I felt my stomach twist, but I stood my ground. "Then I don't live here." His lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. He leaned closer, so close I could smell the whiskey on his breath, and said, "You're not my blood. You're not my problem." That sentence felt like a death blow. My mother burst into tears, begging him to stop, but he grabbed my backpack from the corner, shoved it into my chest, and pushed me toward the door. She clung to his arm, crying out, "Colton, please, he's just a boy." He shook her off. I turned to her one last time. She whispered, "I'm sorry, Ethan." "Please forgive me." I wanted to run back to her, to hold on and never let go, but the door slammed shut between us. I was outside, standing in the sticky night air with nothing but a half-filled backpack and the locket she had once given me. That was the moment my childhood ended. The first night I slept under the old railroad bridge on the edge of town. The ground was damp, and every sound of passing cars made me jump. Hunger gnawed at me, but worse than that was the loneliness. I kept replaying Colton's words in my head, and each time they hit me harder. I wasn't his blood. I wasn't his problem. If even my mother couldn't protect me, who would? The next weeks blurred into a test of survival. I learned where the grocery store threw out expired bread, where the gas station clerk would slip me a sandwich if I offered to sweep the parking lot, and which churches left their doors unlocked during the day so I could sit in the back pew and rest. I kept my job at the corner store for as long as I could, but without an address it didn't last. People started looking at me differently when I showed up in wrinkled clothes. The owner tried to be kind, but eventually he said, "Ethan, you can't keep coming in like this." Customers, talk. I walked away with my last paycheck in my hand and nowhere else to go. At night, I joined other kids who had been cast out like me. Some were runaways, some had parents lost to addiction, and some simply had nowhere else to turn. We shared scraps of food and stories about the families who had failed us. One boy told me his father had thrown him out after catching him stealing. Another girl said her stepmother locked her out of the house one night and never let her back in. For the first time, I realized I wasn't the only one carrying a wound that deep. But that knowledge didn't make the pain lighter. Every day became about finding enough to eat, finding somewhere to sleep where I wouldn't be robbed or beaten, and fighting off the creeping voice in my head that whispered I was worthless. I carried my mother's locket in my pocket, gripping it tightly when despair threatened to drown me. I told myself that if she couldn't save me, at least I could save myself by surviving one more day. The bitterness toward my real father grew inside me like a fire. Why hadn't he been there? Why had he left me to be raised by a man who despised me? Each unanswered question turned into fuel for my anger, and that anger kept me moving. I was 16, living in alleys and under bridges, but I refused to break. I had no idea then that this suffering was only the beginning, and that the truth about my father and who I really was had been waiting for me all along. By the time I reached 30, I had lived more lives than I ever imagined as a boy in Ohio. The years between 16 and 30 hardened me, but they also taught me how to survive when the world seemed determined to forget I existed. I drifted from town to town, sometimes hitchhiking, sometimes walking, always looking for steady work. I worked on farms during harvest season, cleaned motel rooms when they needed someone cheap, and spent months collecting bottles to cash in for coins. There were winters when I thought I wouldn't make it through, when the cold seeped into my bones so deeply I wondered if my body would ever feel warm again. I never found stability. The closest thing was the diner job I landed in Kentucky. It was a squat brick building off a county road, the kind of place where truckers came in at dawn for coffee and eggs, and families filled the booths on Sundays after church. I was the dishwasher, tucked away in the back with a stack of plates taller than me and the constant smell of soap and grease clinging to my skin. The pay was barely enough to rent a small room above a hardware store, but to me, it was more than I'd had in years. There was a strange comfort in routine. I clocked in at 6 in the morning, worked until the dinner rush slowed, and dragged myself home. My hands were cracked from hot water, my back ached from standing all day, but I told myself at least I wasn't on the streets anymore. I had a bed, 4 walls, and enough food to quiet the hunger that had haunted me as a teenager. Still, deep down, I felt invisible. People passed by me without a glance, and the only conversations I had were short exchanges with the waitresses when they dropped off dirty dishes. One evening in late autumn, when the air outside carried the sharp bite of winter, everything changed. I was scraping plates in the back sink when the bell above the front door jingled. The sound barely registered at first, but a few minutes later I heard my name. "Excuse me, is there an Ethan Ward who works here?" The voice was steady, firm, and carried authority. I froze. No one asked for me. No one even knew my name outside of the manager who signed my paycheck. I stepped out from the kitchen, drying my hands on my apron. A man in his 50s stood near the counter. He was tall, with graying hair combed neatly back, and eyes that scanned the room like he had been trained to notice everything. He wore a dark coat and held a leather folder under his arm. "That's me," I said cautiously. "I'm Ethan." He gave a small nod. "My name is Silas Crane. I've been searching for you for 14 years. The diner went quiet. The waitresses exchanged puzzled glances, and a customer lowered his coffee cup, staring at us. I felt my chest tighten. No one searched for people like me. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, thick and sealed with care. He placed it on the counter and slid it toward me. "Your father left instructions. He wanted you found, no matter how long it took. The room seemed to tilt." My legs felt weak, and I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. "My father," I repeated. "I don't even know who he was." Silas's gaze softened. "That is about to change." I stared at the envelope. For years, I had cursed the man who had abandoned me. I imagined him as a coward who left my mother and me to fend for ourselves, a ghost who cared so little that he had never once appeared in my life. And now, a stranger was standing in front of me, claiming my father had left something behind. Fear and anger wrestled inside me. Part of me wanted to tear open the envelope immediately. Another part wanted to throw it in the trash and walk away. I had survived without my father for 30 years. Why should I care now? But curiosity was stronger. My hands shook as I picked it up. The weight of the paper felt heavier than anything I had ever held. "Why now?" I asked. "Why after all these years?" Silas replied. "Because he knew the timing mattered. Because he knew the truth would only make sense once you had endured enough to understand it." I didn't know what he meant. His words hung in the air like smoke, confusing but impossible to ignore. I looked down at the envelope again, my name written across the front in handwriting that wasn't my mother's, wasn't mine, but was somehow meant for me. I tucked it under my arm, unable to open it in front of strangers. My mind raced with questions I had buried for years. Who was my father, really? Why had he stayed away? And what could possibly be inside this envelope that was so important it had taken a man 14 years to track me down? That night, I sat in my small rented room, the envelope on the table in front of me. I stared at it for hours, afraid to break the seal because I knew whatever it contained would change everything. The life I had built, the identity I had carried, even the anger I had used as fuel. It would all be altered once I read the truth. At last, with my hands trembling, I slid my finger under the flap and opened it. Inside was the revelation I had never expected. When I finally opened the envelope, my hands shook so badly I had to steady it against the table. Inside was a thick stack of papers. On top was a bank statement. At first, my eyes skimmed over the numbers without understanding. Then, I saw the balance. $73 million. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and stared again. The number did not change. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. How could a man who had abandoned me, who had left me to be raised by a cruel stepfather, leave behind this kind of money? Why would it have my name on it? Beneath the statement was a handwritten letter. The paper was old, the edges slightly yellowed. My name was written at the top in bold strokes. Ethan, it began. I forced myself to keep breathing as I read. My son, I know this letter will reach you long after I am gone. There is no way for me to know what kind of man you have become, but I have carried you in my heart every day of my life. If you are reading this, it means the time has come for you to know the truth. I stopped and pressed the page against my chest. For the first time in my life, I was reading words from the man who had given me life. The letter continued. When you were born, I was already living in danger. My name is Jonathan Hale. I built a business that grew quickly, but with success came enemies. When your mother became pregnant with you, threats were made. People I trusted turned against me. I realized that anyone connected to me was at risk. To protect you, I made the hardest choice of my life. I stepped away. I gave your mother everything she needed to keep you safe, but I could not stay by her side without putting both of you in danger. My chest tightened as I read. For years I had told myself my father was a coward. Now I was learning he had left not because he did not care, but because he feared for my life. The letter grew heavier with each word. I arranged for money to be placed aside, held in trust, to give you the future I could not provide myself. I asked a man I trusted, Silas Crane, to find you when the time was right. If you are holding this letter, it means I am gone, but my hope is that you now understand why I had to stay hidden. Tears blurred the ink on the page. I wiped them away, determined to read every word. I never stopped loving you, Ethan. Every day I thought of you. Every decision I made was with your safety in mind. I regret that you had to grow up without me, but I pray you can find it in your heart to see that I acted out of love. You were not abandoned. You were protected. I put the letter down and buried my face in my hands. My entire life I had carried the weight of being unwanted. I had believed I was nothing more than a burden. Yet here in my hands was proof that my father had loved me enough to give up everything. The money almost felt secondary compared to the words on that page. $73 million was a number I could hardly comprehend, but the line that echoed in my mind was simple. You were not abandoned. You were protected. I thought of the locket in my old backpack, the one I'd carried for years as a link to a ghost. It was never a piece of my father. It was a piece of my mother's love, a love that had been as trapped as I was. The two loves, my mother's fragile one and my father's distant, protective one, finally settled together in my heart. For the first time since I was a boy, I cried without holding back. All the nights under bridges, all the hunger, all the anger toward a man I thought had left me for nothing. It poured out of me in wave after wave. My chest ached, but in that ache was something new. Release. Hours later, when the tears slowed, I read the letter again. Then again. Each time, I felt the words carving into me, reshaping who I thought I was. I realized that while Colton had thrown me away, while my mother had been too afraid to shield me, my true father had been carrying me in his heart from a distance. I thought back to Silas, standing in the diner, steady and patient, saying he had been searching for me for 14 years. I understood now the weight he must have carried, guarding this secret until the time came. Jonathan Hale had trusted him with the most important task of his life, and Silas had fulfilled it. I stared at the bank statement one more time. $73 million. It felt like more money than the entire world. I thought about the kid I had been at 16, shivering under that bridge, clutching a locket, and wondering if life would ever get better. I thought about how many nights I had gone to bed hungry, how many jobs I had taken just to survive, and now all of that suffering stood beside a fortune I had never imagined. It would be easy to say I felt joy, but the truth was more complicated. I felt grief for the years I had lost. I felt anger that my mother had never told me the truth. I felt confusion about what I was supposed to do with this inheritance. But above all, I felt something I had not felt in years. Hope. My father's letter had given me back my name. Not boy, not burden, not mistake. I was Ethan Ward, the son of Jonathan Hale, a man who had sacrificed presence for protection, a man whose love had reached me across decades. That night, as I folded the letter and placed it carefully back in the envelope, I whispered into the quiet of my room, "I forgive you, Father. Thank you for never forgetting me." After reading my father's letter, I sat in silence for hours. The weight of $73 million was staggering, but the greater weight was knowing that I had not been abandoned. For years, I had told myself a story about who I was, unwanted, forgotten, disposable. That story had shaped how I saw the world and how I saw myself. Now, I held proof that my father had loved me, that his absence had been a sacrifice and not a rejection. The days that followed felt surreal. Silas Crane stayed in town, meeting with me privately to explain how the inheritance had been managed. He spoke in calm, steady tones, making sure I understood the responsibilities that came with wealth of that size. "Your father wanted you to have freedom," Silas told me, "but he also wanted you to be wise. He knew the years of hardship would give you perspective that money alone could never teach." I nodded, though part of me still struggled to believe it was real. I remembered nights when I dug food out of dumpsters, mornings when I begged strangers for change, years when I believed I was worth nothing. And now a man was telling me I had more than enough to never struggle again. But as I sat with it, I realized something important. The money was a gift, but it was not the lesson. The lesson was survival, resilience, and the truth that love can take forms we do not always recognize. My father's love had been distant but determined. My mother's love had been broken but real. Even my own love for myself, though buried under years of shame, had carried me forward. The first thing I did was visit my mother. I had avoided her for years. Carrying anger that she had not defended me that night, Colton threw me out. When I walked into her small apartment, she gasped as if she had seen a ghost. Her hair was gray now, her hands trembling as she reached for me. "Ethan," she whispered, "I thought I had lost you forever." I held back tears and said, "You never lost me, Mom." I just needed to understand why she broke down, apologizing over and over. After Colton left, I was so ashamed. I looked for you, but after a year, then 2, I thought you were better off without the mother who failed you. I thought I didn't deserve to find you. I told her I forgave her. I told her about the letter, about my father's truth. Her eyes filled with both sorrow and relief. For the first time since I was a child, I felt like her son again. Forgiveness gave me peace, but I knew I could not stop there. I thought about the kids I had met on the streets, the ones who shared their scraps of food with me, the ones who disappeared without warning, swallowed by a system that forgot them. I thought about my younger self, shivering in the cold, wondering if life would ever get better. I could not change my past, but I could change someone else's future. I used part of my inheritance to start a foundation for homeless youth. We built shelters with warm beds and hot meals. We provided counseling, job training, and the kind of support that I had desperately needed when I was 16. I visited often, sitting with the kids, listening to their stories. Some of them looked at me with disbelief when I told them I had once been where they were. "You don't look like it now," one boy said. I smiled and replied, "Neither will you one day." Keep fighting. You are not forgotten. Every time I walked out of one of those shelters, I carried a sense of purpose that no amount of money could buy. My father had left me wealth, but more importantly, he had left me the chance to turn my pain into something good. I also kept working, though not as a dishwasher. I found meaning in speaking at schools, churches, and community centers, telling my story so that others would understand what it means to lose everything and still keep going. People listened because they could see I had lived it, that every word came from a place of truth. Now, when I look back at that boy standing outside his home with a backpack and nowhere to go, I wish I could tell him what I know now. I would say, "Hold on. The pain is real, but it will not last forever. You are stronger than you think, and your life has a purpose you cannot yet see." The night my stepfather threw me out, I thought my story was ending, but the truth is, it was just beginning. What I learned is simple but powerful. Sometimes we are broken so we can be rebuilt stronger. Sometimes we are cast aside so we can learn how to stand on our own. And sometimes we are hidden because the world is not yet ready for who we are meant to become. I no longer carry anger as my fuel. I carry gratitude. Gratitude for my father's sacrifice, for my mother's fragile love, for Silas's loyalty, and for my own refusal to give up. And to you, listening to my story now, I want to leave you with this. No matter how forgotten you feel, no matter how cruel the world has been, you are not worthless. You are not beyond hope. Your story is not finished. Thank you for staying with me through mine. If this story touched you, please give the video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, leave a comment about your own journey, and subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing stories of struggle, survival, and hope.